I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. In this episode I'm talking to ecologist and woodland owner Simon Leadbeater. We talk specifically about whether trees are sacred. And spoiler alert, Simon thinks they are, and he does explain eloquently and convincingly why. He touches on books by authors you may well have already read, The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben and Thus Spoke the Plant by Monica Gagliano. However, if you believe trees are sacred and sentient, a problem arises. Namely, do you have any right to move them or prune them or even move amongst them? And it's questions like these that we touch on in the episode. The sound does drop in and out during the interview. Simon stood in the loo at one point to get decent reception, and for the latter part of the interview he stood outdoors, which, considering we recorded this in December and it was a freezing cold day and was getting dark out, was very kind of him. So please stick with it, as what Simon says is very much worth hearing. He jumps straight into explaining the historical significance of woodland groves across the world.
In India there are still many sacred groves, up to 50,000, and they're female nature deities called Devis, or Devi singular, are worshipped. And in the UK, we think of sacred groves and the Druids, of course. Now, where sacred groves come from depends upon where they are. But I would start with looking at ancient Greece as a good sort of starting point for this discussion. And I've researched this area by looking at the works of people like Joy Greenberg, Harold Cusack, and particularly a chap called Matthew Hall, whose book I will refer to later. And they talked about how woodland groves became considered sacred places. And one particular goddess called Armitis, who was the daughter of Zeus and Leto, was known to dwell in sacred groves where wild animals enjoyed sanctuary. And her very name may be derived from the Greek as meaning sacred enclosure. Now, Armitis's presence inhibited the human invasion of the forests. And for centuries, the worship of Armitis is credited with saving significant portions of the Greek landscape from deforestation. So she was a good girl, as it were. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that changed. By the 4th century BC, the philosopher Plato started complaining about deforestation around Athens. He described this as the bare bones of a wasted body. But the thing is, he was actually responsible for that deforestation because he had sanctified the groves dedicated to Armitis, and his new philosophy, rendering the myths around her and other pagan deities, basically saying they were meaningless, actually led to widespread tree felling. Now, he had a pupil, as everyone knows, called Aristotle, and he reinforced this seismic change by creating an anthropocentric or human-centered and zoo-centric, animal-centered worldview based on what he called a great chain of being, or ladder of nature, in which man was at the top and plants ranked just above inanimate objects. Now, this formed part of a critical process in which, instead of considering people as part of nature, in which animals and plants were, if you like, in a form of kinship with them, this started to see nature in an instrumental light, that is, for our utility. So from kinship, we moved to hierarchy and subservience, with everything being skewed for human benefit. And this was a very profound change. In Europe, sacred groves persisted for longer. And there, it wasn't ancient philosophers which did them in, so to speak. It was rather a new religion. And this new religion was Christianity. There is a famous essay written in 1967 by a chap called Lynn White. And basically, he said that Christianity was the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. And it established the widely held view of dominion and suggested that creation had no rationale other than to serve man's purposes. And of course, this all usurped paganism. And as listeners may know, for 2 millennia, Christian missionaries have been chopping down sacred groves because they assume spirits in nature. And one of the interesting things is that when people at the time, reputedly, when the grove was chopped down, they thought the Christian God must be more powerful than their pagan gods because nothing happened. One of the more famous incidents was when Boniface in Germany chopped down some oak trees for his church. I believe the trees were dedicated to Thor, I think. So tree worship was expunged, really. It persisted, but ultimately trees lost all religious significance. The Glastonbury thorn, which everyone's heard of, is the rare exception. So what we've got to is that sacred groves persisted because people believed in deities, and they still do in India to some extent. And the reason they stopped existing was because of the arguments between ancient philosophers and because of a particular form of Christianity. Then you've got my belief in sacred trees, it's just slightly different. And obviously I became interested, and that's why I've researched some of this stuff. But I, in all honesty, I used to see trees as wooden statues benefiting wildlife and nothing much else. And 20 years ago, my wife and I bought a woodland as a sort of wildlife sanctuary. And much as, of course, I like trees, but I didn't think much of them other than as habitat. But in April 4 years ago, we moved here, which is a long story in itself, but suffice to say, I now live on the edge of our woodland. And I felt I was crossing a sort of threshold, and I began to see them very differently. And I didn't really understand my feelings about them. And certainly I began to think of them as sacred, but that confused me because I just associated the word sacred with a religious concept. And then I started reading people like Peter Wohlleben, who we will talk about, and watching Professor Suzanne Simard's TED Talk. And I began to think about this subject more and more. And one of the things I started thinking about was secular definitions of sacred. Because obviously I didn't believe in, tree spirits and so on and so forth. No one in their right mind would. Or so I thought. Anyway, I came up with, I've come up with my own definition, which I'll come to, but I like the work of a chap called Professor Bron Taylor and Dr. Patrick Curry, and some of the definitions they have I think are quite useful. So one would be to confer meaning and transformative healing power. Another version of sacred is beyond human control, intrinsically valuable, wondrous, and not for sale. And finally, imbued with intrinsic value and worthy of reverent care. And I think those are good definitions of sacred, and they don't require us to believe in the supernatural. For me, I began to think, well, what does it mean? Sacred mean to me? And I think what we hold sacred, we consider perhaps dearer than ourselves. We sometimes wish to protect whatever is sacred, its secrecy, and certainly we wish to protect it itself. We would approach something sacred with respect, and we'd wish to look after something sacred with devotional care. There is another component of sacred, which I hope to come to towards the end of our discussion, but that's where I was. And in a way, if we consider trees to be sentient, which we'll talk about in a moment, that's enough to consider them sacred. End of story. We don't need to think more beyond that. There is a but to this. When I read Peter Wohlleben, for example, The Hidden Life of Trees, I came across the work of Dr. Monica Gagliano. And then I also read a book by Judy McAllister called Forest Voices. And suddenly I was encountering the revolutionary, but what many people would consider the absurd idea that trees do, in fact, have a metaphysical or supernatural element, making me think that the idea of dryads, these are tree spirits of Greek mythology, may have some actuality after all. Now, this is a subject all in its own right for different podcasts, but there are some odd coincidences, which, if you have time, I'd like to share with you now. Well, anyone interested in this subject needs to read a novel called The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is a fabulous book. And at the beginning, he will say, as all authors do, that any connection to people alive or dead is coincidental. And indeed, I just took it as a great novel. But then I read an essay by Brian Taylor, who I mentioned, and he explained that the characters are based on real people trying to save the Californian redwoods from being clear-felled in the 1990s. Now, my first feeling was embarrassment because I didn't realize this tragic event had occurred, but so it had. And one of Richard Powers' characters is called Olivia, or Maidenhair, as she became called. And she was based on someone called Julia Butterfly Hill. Butterfly is a nickname. And Julia Hill was a tree sitter, and she sat in a tree called Luna for over 2 years, higher than Nelson's column, and ultimately saved the tree. Now, I wanted to know more about Julia, so I consulted a book called Dark Green Religion by Bron Taylor, and that led me to a book called The Legacy of Luna by Julia Butterfly Hill. Now, the fates of the real Julia and the fictional Olivia are different, but they're clearly the same person. And there is, for example, a storm in each of their respective books. And without doubt, I think Richard Powers must have read Julia Butterfly Hill's story, and he put that into his novel. Now, the thing about all this is that Julia had no experience of climbing trees before, and I do not believe she would have survived 2 years up a tree without believing the tree actually spoke to her. And that might seem a very odd thing to say, but that is what she believed. And I was going to attempt to read out some of what she said, if I can manage to do that. I'm going to read out the bit about the storm, and essentially, the storm is, making the trees sway. It's raining, and she's got next to no shelter. And Julia basically says this: It took all my will to survive. I was trying to hold on to life so hard that my teeth were clenched, my jaws were clenched, my muscles were clenched, my fists were clenched. Everything in my body was clenched and completely tight. I knew I was going to die. I was frightened out of my mind, Luna. I'm losing it. I'm going crazy. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. But in that moment, I heard the voice of Luna speak to me. Julia, think of the trees in the storm. The trees in the storm don't try to stand up straight and tall and erect. They allow themselves to bend and be blown with the wind. They understand the power of letting go, continued the voice, Luna. Those trees and those branches that try too hard to stand up strong and straight are the ones that break. Now is not the time for you to be strong, Julia, or you too will break. Learn the power of the trees, let it flow, let it go. And that is the way you're going to make it through the storms of life. And at that point, she relaxes and starts, in a sense, riding the tree like a fairground ride, laughing. And she survives the storm and much more besides. Well, the coincidences, I think they're coincidences anyway, are these. Olivia, after an accident, this is a fictional Olivia in the novel, after an accident, felt she was guided by beings of light or light beings to engage in these protests. Now, I mentioned Judy McAllister's book, Forest Voices, and essentially her book transcribes the voices of trees across the world. Now, Judy McAllister was the former chief executive of the Findhorn Foundation, whose fellows include Satish Kumar, Jonathan Porritt, and so on. So, it's a serious organization. I think she's a serious person. I want to, emphasize that. So I wondered, who is it that's speaking from the trees that she's recounting? And I had to ferret around in the appendix and so on and so forth. And eventually I found that the beings are called devas. That's to say, a masculine and a devi, I think. And how would you define a deva? Well, a being of light. Now, I accept that does not prove anything at all, but I found it an interesting sort of coincidence. I imagine people are still thinking, well, they'd just like to, ridicule all of this. But before they do, I think they need to consider the work of Monica Gagliano, who I mentioned. And she's a leading plant cognition scientist. And what she says is as follows. The idea that plants have, essentially she says, plants have qualities which are beyond the current scientific constructs allow us to contend with. I think if you read her work, either her scientific work or her book, Thus Spoke the Plant, or indeed see Monica Gagliano on YouTube and so on, you'll realize that she's a very serious scientist and someone who, in my opinion, has to be taken seriously. So to try and summarize where we are in terms of answering your question, when people worshipped Artemis and other pagan deities, forests were preserved and a culture was one of kinship between plants and animals. But Plato and Aristotle replaced kinship with utility and subservience, reinforced by some forms of Christianity, which introduced the concept of dominion, and nature was no longer worshipped, and lo and behold, the forests fell. Now, for myself, I moved into our woodland and began to see trees in a new light, felt they were sacred, and began to think what made them sacred were the ideas of them being wondrous, not for sale, of intrinsic value, all secular foundations for considering sacredness. But then left field, which completely bowled me over, writers came along to echo beliefs held in classical antiquity. So while a tree has never actually spoken to me, although I have met someone to whom they have spoken, nevertheless, I feel a lot of credence needs to be put in the works of Monica Gagliano in particular, and that reinforces to me why trees need to be considered sacred, why we need to restore a sense of sacred to woodland groves.
Would you like to add anything to the end of that question, which is how does this sentience manifest itself in the everyday life of trees?
Okay, I'm going to try and talk about sentience in lay terms. And you mentioned The Hidden Life of Trees, and I think it's a wonderful book, and I think everyone should read it. And one of the things Peter Wohlleben talks about repeatedly is that trees feel pain. He writes, ouch, and so on. But I'm not sure that he explains why or how trees feel pain. But that does touch on our first understanding of sentience, which is to feel. So, where you or I to cut our finger, it would hurt. Therefore, we are sentient. And I think that's one definition of sentience. There is another one, however, which is a bit broader. And this concerns experiencing life subjectively. Now, assuming we haven't just cut our fingers, we are not therefore actively feeling, but we are experiencing this conversation. There's a sort of flow in terms of how we experience life. I want to avoid terms like consciousness because that will get me into terribly difficult terrain. But if we consider for a moment trees communicating via the Wood Wide Web, if we consider a concept of mother trees better connected to the forest than others, favouring their offspring, if we think of trees assisting each other, as Peter Wohlleben says they do, or having association with their own species or indeed other species, which Suzanne Simard talks about with her research on birch and Douglas fir, then I think there's a case for saying trees experience life subjectively. And if they do, then I think there's a case for saying they are sentient. And if we add to this mix the evidence that plants have memory and indeed cognitive abilities, as Gagliano demonstrates in some of her experiments, I think that just reinforces that idea. Now, I think there are people who will just think this silly, and some scientists, I think, would describe these reactions of trees as reflexive or autonomic, I think is the word, like breathing. And I'm not a scientist, and I can't possibly, compete with a scientist in terms of debating one way or the other. But I have a sense that the science is moving in Simard and Gagliano's direction. And I think the important thing is to consider our starting point. We started thinking of trees as sort of Blake's, green things, but we now know they are not inert. Far from being static and unmoving, they swell and contract as they go about their lives. They have a pulse. They exhibit altered states of waking and resting. In other words, they are living organisms. So why should we be so surprised that they might be sentient as other living organisms are?
What I found interesting was I heard Monica Gagliano interviewed, and she was talking about, well, actually, the person doing the question asking was asking her about if trees do perform certain functions, if there is this kind of sentience, then where would the brain be? Where would the consciousness be held? And of course, within the framework of biology, you can't identify that in a tree. And I think that goes back to the kind of anthropomorphism. We can't see beyond the human structure to understand where a consciousness could exist somewhere that's not, I mean, even with humans, we don't really understand it. So I guess we can't possibly try and understand it in trees. But it is an intriguing concept.
Well, what Gagliano says, actually, we are trapped in our own anthropomorphism. But I mentioned academic sentience discussions. There's a journal called Animal Sentience, and I wrote a commentary on one chap, and he made the point that we don't even understand our partners, which is true. Yeah, which is true. But I think the idea of anthropomorphism is actually a very important one, because I was at a session at University College London last week, and there's a chap talking about the Wood Wide Web, and he was a tree expert, and he said that we shouldn't be anthropomorphic about trees, but I sort of think we should, actually, Sarah, in a way. Well, I mean, first of all, what is anthropomorphism? Well, anthropomorphism is attributing human qualities, and mostly we do it to animals. And the thing is, we're encouraged as children to be anthropomorphic. But as we grow up, we're told to put aside childish things. We lose the childish idea that animals feels like us. But of course, that's all wrong, and it's necessarily wrong. Darwin made the great insight over 150 years ago that the difference between people and animals, or human animals and animals, as it were, is one of degree, but very important phrase, one of degree, not kind. In short, we're all animals. Now, in connection with this, there's a lady called Dame Daphne Sheldrick, who has recently died, and she ran an elephant charity in Kenya. And she asserted that in order to understand elephants, you had to be completely anthropomorphic, because their emotions were completely the same as ours. Now, there's a chap called Carl Safini, who's written a marvelous book called Beyond Words, and he said it's not quite true. Elephants are elephants, people are people. We experience the world differently, but difference doesn't mean less. So the point is this: when we're told, and I come to trees, but when we're told not to be anthropomorphic as we grow up, really what is meant, not so much that animals feel differently from us, but rather they feel less than us, or even that they do not feel at all. And in a way, this runs parallel to Plato desanctifying sacred groves by dispelling notions of kinship, which ultimately led to dominion and use or utility. So coming back to trees, I suggest following Darwin. The difference between us and people is a difference of kind, not degree, because they're wildly different. But and I know this creates all sorts of ethical and answerable dilemmas. I suggest that nevertheless they may feel and experience life, and just because they feel and experience life completely differently, that does not mean they feel any less than us. So the question for me is not so much how does a tree's sentience manifest itself in everyday life of that tree, because I don't really know. The question rather is how should that sentience, or that possible, probable sentience, manifest itself in terms of how we relate to and treat trees in our daily lives. That's how I look at it.
Yeah. God, that does open up so many questions. My brain's going whirring round. And I'm thinking just off the top of my head that really the only thing we can all do is maybe take up the Jain religion and
yes, absolutely.
Step back.
Yes.
But
yes.
So actually that leads on to my next question, which is the issue of open access to nature. And you blogged about this recently, and I wondered if you could explain what open access to nature is in your opinion, and why that actually may be problematic in view of what you've just spoken about.
I try and do that, and I suppose I better start by saying I'm not suggesting for a minute we shouldn't have access to nature at all. That would be an absurd thing to say. But my views extend from considering trees sacred and animals feeling in ways similar, not the same, but similar to us. And in my blog, I refer to Bambi, the book, not the film. And I believe its anthropomorphism is appropriate. And I'd also, in answering the question, cast your mind back to when I said the worship of Artemis prevented the human invasion of forests because those forests were sacred to her. Now, I was invited to write a blog by Nearby Wild, and I decided to do so because I think this is a very thorny, misunderstood subject, and I think it's very political. I think some political parties wish to promote what's called a right to roam, which basically means people can, with exceptions, walk wherever they like, presumably accompanied by their dogs. And I feel, in a way, this is part of a toff-bashing agenda, if I can put it like that, and simply hasn't been thought through at all. And actually, without realizing it, it's a human supremacy agenda, which puts human interests above all else. And if we think about it for a moment, even relating it to our gardens, we wouldn't think it okay to walk up to a blackbird nest, for example. If we knew a blackbird were nesting in a particular hedge, we would steer clear. We would give that nest respect because we would know going close would frighten Mummy Blackbird away. And no one, I think, would consider it okay for people to visit woodlands with their dogs to disturb badger sets, ground nesting birds, chase foxes, and so on and so forth. So that was my introduction. But I have to say, really, apart from encouraging people to read my blog, The Sixth Driver of the Sixth Extinction, and to look at the research which emphasizes the harm inappropriate access can cause, but also how, in a way, access transforms a wildlife habitat into a human habitat, and that is a factor behind species declines and extinctions. But most of my views derive from actually my own experience of living here. And as a dog owner, I know that our dogs, if we let them, will just chase the deer and the foxes and everything else. And I can't control other people's dogs as we do ours, but not infrequently I hear, the plaintive calls of owners who don't seem to realise that if they let their dogs off on the footpath near a woodland, the dogs will simply chase wildlife. That's what they do. I'm also conscious of my own impact on wildlife. As I say, it's obvious. If the deer see me, they look at me and they scalp her because they're terrified of me. And that's true of almost all wildlife. But occasionally, just occasionally, because we don't go in our woodland very much, occasionally I see wildlife like foxes and deer bathing in the sun just as we do. And I suddenly realised what their behaviour would be were I not there. So in short, I have no right to roam in our own woodland because I consider the woodland belonging to the denizens of the forest, if you like, and not to me. So to try and summarise, habitat loss, which includes human invasion, is, according to one writer I know, the greatest source of animal suffering. And what I want to try and do in our woodland is to create the conditions for happiness, not suffering. And the right to roam actually only thinks about us. And I think we need to be rightfully anthropomorphic to have empathy for animals who call woodlands wild places home. And above all else, they want to be left alone, Sarah.
So in view of that, I was reading your blog and I thought, well, how do we then, in light of how we are at the moment in society, in view of attitudes to the environment, in view of the fact that we have less and less of a connection with nature, how do we regain that connection with nature if we keep, apart from it really? Do we need to build nature reserves for humans and then keep the real wildlife beyond the fences?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I don't have I don't think I have a very good answer, to be honest. But I would agree with you. I attended another session at University College London a couple of weeks ago, and they had speakers including Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural England, and Stephanie Hilborn, who used to be CEO of the Wildlife Trust. And there were 6 speakers in all, and every single one of them said that their engagement with nature as children galvanized them into leading careers in conservation. So the idea of separating people from nature, which you might say Plato started, would, be madness. And I would never, I hope no one would think I was saying that. There is a tension, I think, between enabling people to have access to nature for a whole host of benefits and allowing nature's denizens the right to happy, undisturbed lives. The way I'm going to try and resolve it is I would like to encourage part of our woodland to have access to volunteers to look after it, and particularly young people, young children, to play in it, if you like. And my idea would be to sort of rekindle the idea of sacred values of nature and also caring for the area. That's a difficult one, but essentially what I'm trying to do is separate the wild part of the woodland, which in a sense I'm rewilding. The human activity is not required, and all it will do is chase animals away. And a part of the woodland where there used to be a lot of human activity in terms of coppicing, there's a chalk slope which needs scything once a year and so on, which would actually benefit from there being less deer to prevent the browsing and so on. And that way I get a balance between people engaging with nature and hopefully learning what they can contribute to nature, and leaving the greater part of the woodland to the wild. And I hope that balance is one which might work. It's not a perfect answer, Sarah, but that's how I'd like to do it. If you allow people access ubiquitously, I think it's a sort of tyranny in a way, because animals then never are able to find peace. And I just think that's a wrong approach.
Okay, well, that does sound like a solution that that certainly could work. So I guess leading on from that was my next question, which was you wrote to me that we need to consider the feelings of trees themselves. So I guess leaving them to their own devices is one way we could do that. Are there any other ways that we might do that?
Yes, I rather created a question for myself there. I'd like to try and answer that in a particular way, and I don't know if I'm answering your question completely, but let me have a go anyway. My view is we don't know exactly how trees feel, but assuming they feel differently from us does not mean they feel less. I think I've said that. And looking at the question in these terms is almost trying to understand a biological, ecological question. And I wonder if we could consider things a bit differently. So in other words, answering your question, when we walk into a woodland, we might think, yes, it's amazing that trees are feeling and doing things, all sorts of amazing things. And under our feet, there is this astonishing wood-wide web. And this alone should make us want to tread lightly and to be in awe and so on. But what if we use different language for that same experience? And I'm going to quote Judy McAllister again. And she describes walking through a woodland as if to walk through what she calls a living prayer. To be part of the prayer, a sense of belonging, of knowing that I was part of a great web of life. Now, this language resonates with me because it emphasizes kinship and also the reverence for life. Now, I would like to try and mention a sort of vignette, something that happened to me last Saturday. And this may seem not connected, but I really do think this answers your question, Sarah. On Saturday, I had to, for various reasons, drive to, of all places, Aylesbury. And SatNav took me up the M1, and it asked me to go off at junction 11A, which is a new junction. And I found myself on the Dunstable bypass. And the scene I saw just overwhelmed me. I felt it almost physically, certainly viscerally. And for some reason, and this may sound a bit odd, but I was transported to the end of one of my favourite films, which is Waterloo, which stars Rod Steiger and Christopher Plummer, for those who don't know. And at the end of this film, the Duke of Wellington gently rides around the battlefield, surveying the carnage and desolation. And he says, there's no thing sadder than a battle won, save a battle lost. Now, in this case, in place of stricken French standards, there were signs all along this new motorway presaging developments of one sort or another. So here was countryside, a habitat of sorts, in the process of complete annihilation. Anyway, I drove on. And finally, I reached what I consider proper countryside, and I sort of sighed a breath of relief at chocolate box villages and gentle rolling countryside. And then I noticed in particular these very tidy hedges. And then I noticed they'd been flailed within an inch of their lives and were completely denuded of any berry to sustain anything. And then I noticed that there weren't any birds. So, in this one journey, this one journey encapsulated the problem as expressed in my part of the world, and Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire, and so on. And it's simply extinction. And it's extinction everywhere for anyone who cares to look for the very obvious signs. Either it's through the complete extirpation of an environment through rodal development, or it's a sort of chocolate box denuded version of extinction. Now, coming back to your question, Sarah, you said, why do we need to consider the feelings of trees themselves? What would this involve, and why is it important? Well, what I saw on my journey to Aylesbury was a landscape belonging to us, transformed and reshaped for human purposes, predicated on the assumption that nature does not feel, cannot hurt, ours to use and ours to use as we feel fit. Now, the question I would ask is, what if instead we venerated nature and attributed feelings to nature? Now, it occurs to me that veneration of nature, which we talked about earlier, may involve an element of fear, and people did in the past fear incurring the wrath of the gods. But I think I said that what was sacred, what we held sacred, was dearer than us, and we would like to look after that sacred thing with devotional care. Or in other words, what that says to me is that we love that which we consider sacred. Now, love means different things, but I mean specifically what I think may be pronounced agape, or agape. It's spelled agape. Maybe it's Greek. Maybe it's pronounced agape, which is a spiritual love, or the highest form of love you can have. The sort of love you would have for God, or God would have for us, and so on. And the interesting thing is that Julia Butterfly Hill actually talks of agape in her book. And it seems to me this type of love is, of course, a healing, redeeming, and transformative love. And in other words, if we acted with that love, we would not be flailing our hedges or driving new destructive roads through the countryside. So to sort of conclude, really, what I'm trying to say is that if we rekindled our veneration for nature and restored a sense of the sacred to trees and woodland groves, I think that would help love permeate our daily lives. Now, for Julia Hill, that's now expressed in what she calls being joyously vegan. That's how she called it. I think rediscovering the sacred would possibly mean different things for different people. But expressing love with every mouthful, or every step and breath we take, every decision we make, I think that is how we could translate our sense of veneration for nature, our sense of sacred feeling trees into our daily lives. I hope this is a potentially powerful idea. And the key, in a sense, is the translation of the veneration of the sacred into how we live on a daily basis. And that's why I think we should consider trees as feeling sacred beings.
This is such an interesting and relatively unexplored topic, which carries huge implications for the way we garden and indeed live our lives. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so reach out to me or Simon on social media and let us know what you think. I've put links to his channels in the show notes, plus links to all the books and online articles he mentioned. So I'd like to say a really big thank you to Simon for taking part in the interview, and of course thank you to you as always for listening, and I will catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.